Okay, I'm hanging out with my good friend Josh Mettle. We're going to talk about a topic that I've heard a lot about. And then I heard my friend Josh here speak about it. And all of a sudden, this hit me at a different level. And the idea is we have inflation. And
We do.
inflation is
That's a fact.
it's a fact. It's always happening, but how can we use inflation for debt destruction and wealth building and as investors? And I think Josh had an amazing take on this. And before we get into that, I want to go through real quick. Josh, give us like the spiel. Who are you? What do you do? Where's your business? We know you're in mortgage, but let's go through that real quick, just so everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Anton. Appreciate you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, first of all, I'm a husband. I'm a father of two teenage kids. Woo, that's exciting. Got a great dog. I live in Park City, Utah, and we do a lot of mountain biking. We do skiing, play a lot of pickleball, a lot of hiking, a lot of boating, a lot of fishing. So, I'm a kid at heart and love to play. When I'm not trying to chase my favorite rugrats and make my wife happy, I do a lot of real estate investing with my mother, who's been my partner for the last 24 years. And, interesting story about me, Anton. My mom and I started buying investment properties right around 2000. Maybe it was 99. And we were just too stupid to sell anything. And it turns out that almost every investment that you buy and hold for 20 years is like a screaming success. And so turns out 24 years later, we're a lot smarter than we thought we were, or probably smarter than we actually are. But inflation has pushed up the value of those properties. But what's really struck me is how inflation has increased the rents from those properties. And just anecdotally, I'll give you an example of what I mean. The first 8-plex that we bought back in, I think this was 2002 when we acquired this property. The rents on that property were $275 a month for a 2-bedroom, 850 square foot apartment with a deck that overlooked the entire downtown Salt Lake and the Great Salt Lake with epic sunsets, $275 a month. Those same units now rent for $1,695 a month. Plus we charge parking, plus we charge storage fees. And I would have never have thought that. Like 24 years ago, I would have never thought. I thought, hey, this building's going to go from a $300,000 building to a $600,000 building. I would have thought that over 24 years. I would not have thought that the rents would have went from $275 to almost $1,700 a month. And that's really kind of blown my mind. So we do a lot of real estate investing, single family, multifamily, retail properties, medical office buildings. We've got a pretty good portfolio here in Utah. And it's just, it's become quite the passion for me to talk about that and help other people be successful in that.
And then what's your day job, sir?
Yeah, of course. And then we're partners in a mortgage company called Neo Home Loans. We lend in 49 states. And really the Neo Home Loans was born with the belief that the mortgage, when structured correctly, could make people more wealthy. And it's more about the advice around structuring a mortgage that can have incredible impacts on people's financial well-being. So the idea with Neo was spread financial literacy to increase and improve communities throughout the United States by using indebtedness in the right way.
Amen. Amen. And so what I want to do today, Josh, is like, how do we introduce this concept, of inflation? How do we talk about, where do you want to start for our listeners, and this is the things we're always talking about. We're literally always talking about finance, money, wealth building, mindset. So this is a perfect conversation. Where do you want to go from here, brother?
Let's start with the problem.
Okay.
And the problem is that inflation is an insidious tax that we are all paying by the devaluation of the dollars that we're working so hard to earn.
Yeah.
And if we're not aware of it, if we're not aware of the destructive capacity of inflation, then we're a victim of inflation. If we understand inflation and we understand how it's devaluing the dollar, we can actually take a short position out against the US dollar. Now, the government, the federal government, the US federal government is by far the largest borrower in the world. Nobody's
Yes.
even close, right? So I want to position my real estate activities and my investment philosophy alongside those of the US government, because I think there's incentives in what the government is doing by borrowing big and then causing inflation. And trust me, the inflation numbers that we get through the CPI reports, that's all bullshit. Like, inflation is run a lot hotter than that. But today we'll just assume that the CPI numbers are accurate, but we know that these have been drastically changed over time. In fact, if you took the CPI inflation models that we had in the 70s and you overlaid it over today's numbers, you'd be still running at inflation rates that are 7 or 8%, not 2.7%. But we'll just talk about the CPI numbers because that's bad enough. So here's the problem. We are, as a country, almost $36 trillion in debt.
Wow.
And unfortunately, we're adding almost $1 trillion to debt every 100 days. And the interest on that debt, because interest rates have gone up so much, the interest on that debt is now almost $1 trillion a year. So the interest on our national debt is greater than our defense and war spending, not as much as Social Security, but we're getting up there. And it is a massive tax on this country. And unfortunately, what's happening is, so if you look at US federal budget deficit, we're about 2.2 trillion
Yes.
is what we're running. But that is accelerating because interest rates are accelerating. So we're paying the bonds that we borrowed at 0.5% and 1% interest are rolling off the balance sheet, and they're being replaced with 4% interest. So it's like this, massive jump in the amount of interest that's being paid on this debt. That's a huge problem. I'm going to take you now to a slide deck and show you something that is a little crazy. So I'm actually going to start on this slide. This is total outstanding debt in trillions of dollars. We just showed you on the debt clock that this is now, almost $36 trillion in indebtedness. But here's the crazy thing, just to kind of show the pace at which this debt is accelerating. Let's give this a little bit of context over a period of time. Yeah. So it took the US government 220 years to borrow $11 trillion from, let's just call it roughly, the 1800s through 2000. It was a little before that, but ballpark, 220 years, okay? You see this just hockey stick curve up in terms of debt right after COVID. But here's the really frightening thing, dude. Since 2020, the US has added 11 trillion in debt. So it took us 220 years to get to 11 trillion in debt. But over the last 4 years, we've added an additional 11 trillion. And the problem with this is you're borrowing all this money, you're putting it into, the government is spending this money, and it causes inflation. I mean, there's more than, this is not the only way that inflation is created. Of course, there's quantitative easing and other things that the Federal Reserve does. But the sheer massive wall of borrowing from tomorrow and spending today is causing massive amounts of inflation. And I'll just kind of give you like, what does that mean, right? Like, let's put the inflation into context since we're talking about this problem. So this is a map of cumulative, or a graph, I should say, of cumulative inflation going back to 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve was created. And if you just go from 1913 to 1970, let's just call it 60 years to make the math easy, you had 284% of cumulative inflation. So you had, let's just round it up, 300% inflation over 60 years. That means that every 10 years, that 5-cent piece of bubblegum went to 10-cent piece of bubblegum. It doubled. But over 20 years, it's really not that big of a deal. It's manageable, right? It isn't destruction of your wealth because wages probably went up in line with that. But in 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. That is the moment that the US dollar was no longer redeemable for gold. At that moment, it was backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. And I can tell you that's not working out all that well for us, Anton, because since that time, you've seen inflation go from a cumulative 284% from 1970 to 2022. Let's just call it 50 years. You've seen 2,923% total cumulative inflation, but let's just minus out the 300% from 1970. So from 1970, went from 300% to 2,900%, which means we'd had 2,600% inflation over 50 years. Okay, what is that like? Let's put that into perspective. What that means is a $10 dinner in 1970 now costs $260 to feed your family.
Wow.
And it's insane. And the problem is that wages, especially wages for the middle and lower class, but even upper class people are feeling crunched. The wages have not kept up with this inflation. And what happens is if you're like you and you're like me and we own a bunch of assets, well, my 8plex went from a $300,000 valuation to a $2 million valuation. The rents that I was charging at $275 a month are now $1,700 a month. So I can manage this inflation because my assets have inflated and my rents have gone up, our stock dividends have gone up, et cetera, et cetera. But the person who doesn't own assets is just getting absolutely crushed. So that's the problem. So let's pause there for a minute. Let's talk about that. And then let's get to, I did say there was some good news here. So we'll get to the good news at some point.
So for the average person who, because you just gave some like astounding numbers, what changed? Because inflation was going along at a steady clip. I get it. We got off the gold standard. Was it just getting off the gold standard that changed it? Was it the government changed its spending habits? Did we do other things? Or was it literally just getting off of gold?
Well, when you aren't tied to an asset, so if the dollar is backed by, could be oil, it could be gold, it could be anything that has scarcity and utility, right? Something valuable and scarce. When it's backed by that, there's a constraint in how much you can borrow because you actually have to repay with productivity. So you're thinking, just like you and I think, Anton, okay, I'm going to borrow $1 million and I'm going to go buy this business. I'm going to go buy this house. I'm going to go buy this building. And I have to be able to pay back that indebtedness by the economic viability of that asset we're going to buy. So it puts a constraint on our borrowing. How many times have you looked at a building, a business, a house, and you said, nah, I'm not sure that asset is going to create enough cash flow to pay the debt service, and I'm going to have a decent amount of return for all my trouble. We do that all the time as investors, right? Okay, but imagine you no longer had that constraint. Imagine you could say, well, I'm not sure it's going to give me a significant return or not, but it doesn't really matter because I can just borrow another $1 million to pay back that bad debt if I make a mistake, right? There's no constraint in the amount you can borrow because when these treasury bonds, which is the way that the government funds its deficits, when these treasury bonds are at the end of their 10-year period or whatever long the treasury bill or bond is, they are not paying that back with cash flow. Like when we borrow a 30-year mortgage, we pay that debt down over 30 years. And at the end of the 30 years, there's no more indebtedness. That's not the way the US government's working. They're just borrowing more dollars to pay back the old dollars, plus all the interest that they owe on those dollars. So because it's not backed by gold anymore, it just enabled the US government to radically increase the amount of borrowing because, hey, I can just pay it back with more borrowed dollars. And that was a piece of this inflationary matchbox that was lit at that time.
Because the bill never came due and the financials didn't have to make sense.
That's right. That is exactly right. And the US government can just, there's all kinds of these stories. I was listening to a podcast with Elon Musk and Joe Rogan. Wonderful interview that he just did last week.
Yes.
And Elon was talking about these charging stations that they've spent $1 billion. The federal government has spent $1
Yes.
billion. And they were supposed to build a charging station with like 8 chargers. There's like 1 charger that works. $1 billion for 1 charger, right? So that we've completely lost any type of control mechanism around, does this investment make sense and will it yield me enough return to pay the investment? Because I don't care. I'm just going to borrow $2 trillion to pay back that trillion, and then I'll have enough money to pay the interest. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. Makes total sense. And we actually referenced that on another episode in the podcast. So thank you everyone that subscribes. If you have any questions, drop them below. But there was $50 billion in the Infrastructure Act for 2 things. And those 2 things were chargers and rural broadband. And we've delivered 0 rural broadband and, like you said, a handful of chargers. And they've currently have 50 billion allocated and nothing's happening. So it's no wonder it's gone up, what did you say, 2,600% since the gold standard?
Yeah, inflation, cumulative inflation since 1970, up 2,600%. So that means your $10 meal now costs your family $260. And the problem with that is wages haven't kept pace.
Okay, so now that we basically nuked everyone's hopes and dreams, how do we think about this as investors? How do we strategically position ourselves? What should we be doing now that we know this problem exists? Or where do we go from here, Josh?
When we talk about inflation, we're talking about the rate of inflation going up. But just for people who aren't students of inflation or haven't thought that deeply about it, what it means is the buying power of your dollar goes down, right? In 1970, for $10, you could take your family out and have an extravagant meal with wine for $10. Now that meal costs $260, right? So the buying now for $10, what can we buy? French fries, right? So the buying power of that dollar is going down. And here's an illustration going back to 1913, which is when the Fed was created. And the Fed is the root of all evil on this because they want inflation in the system. It behooves them. So, and it behooves the federal government. And we're going to get to that. So if you look at the value of $100 starting back in 1930, and you look at the devaluation of that dollar from 1913 to 2023, so let's call that 110 years, we now that same $100 only has $3.20 in purchasing power. Wow. Said another way, the US dollar has lost nearly 97% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was founded. So what that means is, if you're holding your dollars in a checking account, a savings account, mattress money, you have been robbed 97% of your life savings. And we have to align our investment strategy with what is happening in the market and what is being created by the Fed and the federal government. We have to understand their plan so we can benefit from the same set of incentives. And I'm going to show you how we can do that. But I need to get all my slides up here. Okay, cool. So we're going to talk about something that I was taught by a gentleman by the name of Jason Hartman. You can find him on YouTube. He has a great podcast. You can go to jasonhartman.com. This guy's brilliant. I really enjoy this human. He's taught me a lot. And he introduced me in a podcast I was doing to him to something called inflation-induced debt destruction. And if that kind of makes your eyes water over and your frontal lobe throb, that's okay. It did me too. The only reason why I think I was really able to assimilate this information, Anton, is because I've owned properties for long periods of time. Almost 25 years I've owned the same buildings. And that has given me a longer perspective to see how this insidious inflation can both be a destroyer of wealth and also a destroyer of debt. So I'm
Yes.
going to walk you through this. Sometimes I can go too fast. So please stop me if you have any questions, okay? What this is essentially an amortization chart. And as I recall the conversation I had with Jason, this was an actual amortization chart for a mortgage that I believe his mother took out this loan and bought this house. And so this is a case study, if you will, going 30 years from 1972 and paying off in 2001. As of 1972, the house value was $18,000. The mortgage amount was $14,000. The interest rate was 7.37%. Hey, that's about today's interest rates. The mortgage term, yeah, and this actually worked out quite well for her. So this is such a great example for that reason. The mortgage term was 30 years. The monthly mortgage payments were $100. She put 20% down, and we assume she had a tax rate of 33%. And in this analysis, we're showing interest as being tax deductible. Hopefully, under a Trump presidency, we might see that again on our owner-occupied homes. So hopefully, we can write off the interest now, but oftentimes the standard deductions are greater. I'm hopeful that this will become more advantageous for us in the future. Okay. So we know that inflation destroys the value of the dollar over time. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, we just showed that.
We showed that. That is a fact. So what we did was we mapped the annual inflation rate for each year from 1972 to 2001, which when we say inflation is going up at 3.2%, that means the value of your dollar, your buying power, is going down by that amount.
100%.
So we can say then that in 1972, the value of a dollar was $1 because that's the start of our measuring. But each year, as we adjust for inflation, now that dollar only buys 94 cents in goods. In 1974, we have 11% inflation. Now that dollar in 1972 that's been sitting underneath my couch and I've just been sitting there, now I only have 84 cents of buying power. So this brings about a concept that I want to mention, the difference between real and nominal. You'll hear this in economics a lot, right? The real GDP versus nominal GDP. So let's just define that real quick. Nominal means name alone. What did they call a $100 bill in 1913?
The $100 bill.
$100 bill. And in 2024, we call it a $100 bill. But they are very different because we know that in 1913, versus 2023, we were showing that previous graph that in real terms, you only have $3.20 in buying power left from that $100 bill. So they're very different things, but we still call it a $100 bill. So in nominal terms, it's a $100 bill is a $100 bill. In real terms, I only have $3.20 worth of buying power over that 100-year period of time. So we're going to talk about real and nominal. So in nominal terms, in name alone terms, every single year she made $100 a month payments, which is $1,200 per year in payments. And this is the actual number of dollars that left her bank account every single year. $36,000 left her bank account over that period of time. But was the dollar worth the same amount in real terms? And the answer is no. Over that 30-year period of time, so here's an easy way to think of it. If she dropped a dollar bill in her couch and she found it 30 years later, it would only be worth 23 cents. She would have lost 77 cents in value over that period of time. So in nominal terms, name alone, she paid out $36,000 towards principal and interest on that mortgage. In real inflation adjusted payments, because each year the value of that dollar goes down, she actually only repaid $16,000. And then if you apply for the fact that the interest is tax deductible, she only actually repaid, once you have after tax inflation adjusted payments, she paid back $12,654, which is pretty crazy, Anton, because she borrowed $14,000 and she only paid back $12,000. Oh, wow. Okay. So what does that mean? Now let me define something here. The common question that I get when I'm doing this presentation live is, why does it, she's making a $1,200 annual payments, $100 a month, but why does it feel like she's making less payments? What if the value of the dollar is going down, why does it feel like she's paying less? Well, that's because inflation causes wages to go up over time. So in 1972, the national average yearly salary, not household income, but just a single person's average salary was $7,133. I'm sorry, this is annual, right? So we're talking $600 a month is the monthly income. And $100 a month in her case was going out towards that mortgage. So she's got $600 worth of income, $100 a month is going out to the mortgage. But if you follow the average income up over that same year, 30-year period of time, now she has $32,000 of income per year. What is that? $2,800 a month in income coming in. But she has the same $100 a month going out. So do you want to have $600 a month in income and pay $100 a month in mortgage? Or do you want to have $2,700 a month in income and pay $100 a month mortgage? So it feels like that payment is less significant over time because her income is going up. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, because as your income rises yearly, the mortgage is a fixed amount. Plus, when we got off the gold standard, the purchasing power started constantly going down at a much more rapid rate.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Crazy.
So the mortgage payment stays the same.
Yeah.
But your income as a borrower goes up. Or in my case of my anecdotal story of my first 8-plex, my rents went from $275 to $1,700, but my mortgage payment was the same.
Yes.
So another way we could say that is inflation destroys debt, because we're borrowing in dollars, today's dollars. If I borrow today, I'm borrowing in 2024 dollars. But if I'm paying that loan over 30 years, I'm going to pay it back in $2,034, $2,044, $2,054. And the value of the worth of those dollars is going to be significantly less over that period of time. And that is an amazing, just tremendous tailwind for us as investors.
So before you move on to your next thought, here's one thing I want to cement this home with people. Do we believe the federal government is going to spend more money?
You know, I was watching this Rogan podcast with both JD Vance and Elon, and they claim that they are going to create this government efficiency, the Department of Government Efficiency or something like that, that Elon's going to be a part of. There's a talk of Rand Paul being a part of. So I have a prayer that they're going to get this thing under control. But if I look back at the history of the last 220 years, I'd say we're effed.
Yeah. So I want to go on the basic premise. Even if they get spending somewhat under control, even if they make the government 20% more efficient, the government's going to spend more money. Yes or yes?
Yes, and yes.
Yes. Okay. And the Federal Reserve is going to keep some level of inflation cooked into our system so that national debt goes down.
Yes. So the value of the national debt is what you're saying, right?
Exactly. Yes. So the value or the purchasing power of the national debt goes down. So we know they're going to spend more. We know we're going to keep inflation in the system, so the value of the national debt goes down. Therefore, you and I now have to be looking at this going, how do we structure our portfolio? How do we structure our systems? How do we structure our wealth investing, our wealth creation to take advantage of, I wouldn't even call it a tailwind. I call it a tsunami. Like, This is way more than the rising tides. This is that huge momentum of water and wave lifting and pushing everything in a very specific direction. Did I miss
100%.
anything there, brother?
No, you're exactly right. But let's just tie in the incentive there to make sure people catch that very important distinction.
Yes, please.
I think the best way to do this, now that I think about it, let's go back to the US debt real quick. And let's tie in this incentive. So if inflation destroys debt and the US government is the number one debtor in the world, who stands to benefit the most by higher rates of inflation?
The US government.
The US government. So that's an incentive.
Yeah.
How do they do that? So people can understand. Okay, well, if we cause inflation, and I was on X this morning and I saw this post that this woman had a picture of the cost of butter in her grocery store just like 2 years ago, 2022, I think it was. And it was $3.50. No, sorry, $3 for this cube of butter. And she took a picture of it because she thought it was preposterous, because just a few years before she remembered it being $1 or 50 or something like that. So she took a picture like, this is insane. Butter is now $3 for this cube. Well, the picture this morning was today's cost of the butter, and it was $5.50. So it had not quite doubled, but let's call it an 80% increase in the cost of butter at her store in 2.5 years. So think of this at scale. The cost of everything is going up, which means there's more revenue. It's causing a greater measured amount of gross domestic product across the country, because there's tax and revenue on that butter being sold. And so as incomes go up, as property taxes go up, as all of those things go up, that causes the income to the federal government, the tax revenue, to go up. So inflation causes the US federal tax revenue to go up. And the only way you get this thing under control is if you can grow the federal tax revenue faster than you can grow the national debt. And then you have some possibility of balancing the budget or paying off this debt. But they want inflation because inflation leads to higher salaries with higher cost of goods and services, which leads to more tax revenue, which enables them to then inflation to destroy their debt. Did that make sense?
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
So
to your point there, we want to align our investment objectives with the objective of the federal government, which is we have to cause inflation to destroy this debt.
Yes. So what did you do, or what should our listeners be doing to create that alignment?
Yes, that is the question. So how do you do that? All right. So let's go back to, and we're kind of getting to the punchline here. All right. So I'm going to present again. Share screen window, and here we go. Okay. Can you see this okay, Anton?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. So this is my schedule of real estate owned. And it's a little old, a couple of months, but not a big deal. So we have a portfolio of roughly $94 million in value. And then we have some debt against that. We've got, anyways, I'll get to the debt in a minute. This property, 94 million, has about $45 million in debt that we carry across the portfolio. And so I want to be thinking about, well, what is the true cost of that debt if we adjust for inflation? Just like we did on the home of Jason Hartman's mother, instead of looking back over 30 years, I want to try to forecast it forward so that I can understand what the real cost of that $45 million is. So what I did was I took that debt and I created a blended rate calculator. Actually, this is a tool that a company we use called MBS Highway gives us. So we can put in all of the debts that we have, the corresponding interest rate, and it'll calculate a blended rate. So the blended rate across. Yep. So, this is a larger loan. This is a smaller loan amount than the $14 million shopping center loan. So it's going to average your loan amounts and your interest rates to give you a blended rate across the full 43 million. As if it was one loan, here's what I would be paying. Okay. But we know that in nominal terms, that's the blended rate. But what is the cost of that debt in real terms once we adjust for inflation? So we created this inflation destroys debt calculator, which I'll give your listeners. They can go on and use this for free. So we just plug in the mortgage balance. I'm just assuming a 30-year term.
Yep.
The monthly principal and interest payments across that entire portfolio is $223,000 a month, and I'm using the annual inflation rate of 3.93%. Why 3.93%? It's CPI is lower than that now. Yes, but if you go back to 1971 and you look at the average inflation rate from 1971 to 2024, the average inflation rate has been about 3.93%. So I'm going to use the average inflation rate over the last
over that whole time period.
Correct, over that 54-year period of time. And then I'm going to put in the average interest rate, right? So mortgage amount, payment, inflation adjustment, and what's the interest rate on that loan? Okay. So here's the punchline. Your $43 million in indebtedness over 30 years would have you having nominal payments of $80,400,960. So in nominal terms, that's how many dollars are going to leave my business accounts to repay those real estate mortgages. But inflation adjusted, because we can anticipate that inflation will be, I'm just assuming it's going to be something similar to what we've averaged the last 54, 53 years. In real terms, my inflation adjusted payments are only $45,096,966. So let me ask you a question. Anton, if I gave you $43 million today, would you pay me back $45 million in 30 years?
Yeah, 4 million%, yes. Brother. 4 million%.
Hell yes. $1.5 million cost to borrow $43 million for 30 years. My inflation adjusted rate is 0.08% when you adjust for inflation. And here I'll just show anybody who wants to see. So my recommendation for you is this. My recommendation for you is to understand inflation. Inflation destroys idle dollars. If you don't have those dollars working for you and invested in something that is growing greater than the rate of inflation, you're losing. The government's winning, the Fed's winning, you're losing. Takeaway number 2. Take a look at your current loans that you have on your properties, your businesses. Put it through this calculator and look at what your real after inflation cost on that debt is, because it's very possible you shouldn't be paying down that debt. You perhaps shouldn't be selling that property. Perhaps you should even be borrowing against that property to buy another property, because once you adjust for inflation, the cost of that debt is actually a lot less than you think over long periods of time. And I think the last takeaway that I would have is that there is this tremendous luxury that we have in the United States. It's called a 30-year fixed mortgage, and you can get them on residential properties where you can't get that in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, in Canada. They have 5-year, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, maybe you can get 10-year fixed. But the beauty of a 30-year fixed mortgage is that you lock in that payment for tremendously long periods of time, where your payment stays the same, but your rents from that investment go up over long periods of time. So take advantage of that luxury that we have here. I think people sell in and out of properties way too quickly, and then they sometimes don't 1031 exchange. They pay taxes on that. They pay real estate commissions. They pay mortgage companies like my mortgage company fees for setting up new mortgages. And perhaps you should just sit on that property for a very long period of time and let this miracle of inflation induce debt destruction work for you?
Mic drop. Boom. Just to maybe summarize or recap this, the idea is, how do I go find long-term fixed debt, try to get as much of that debt as possible that is at a low rate or below the rate of inflation,
Yep.
or near? I guess even some of it being near the rate of inflation is fine because the inflation eats it.
Yep.
And simply work on the cash flow, the maintaining of the property, the quality tenants, the quality of the property, and let time work all of its magic. Did I summarize that well?
I think it's great. And I think the objection that many listeners might be having as we record this in November of 2024 is, yeah, that's great, Anton, but a 7, or maybe on a single family
Yeah.
investment property, 8% mortgage rate, right? Somewhere in that range. How do you make anything cash flow? So I am not a proponent of buying investments that don't have a cash on cash return. Like I
Yeah.
will not chase an asset with dollars unless I can get to a cash flow positive place and a decent cash on cash return within the first 6 months. And I'll maybe buy something that doesn't make sense because the rents are undervalued. I'm going to go invest some more dollars, but I've got a clear plan to get to a positive cash on cash return with that investment within that, whatever that first 6 month period or however long the renovation project is. So I'm not proposing that that debt is good and you should just go out and get in debt. But if you can put debt on an asset that is positive cash flow, you not only have the benefit of the positive cash flow, you not only have the appreciation of the property, but you have the devaluation of that debt over periods of time. And I share that with you because I believe that a lot of the job numbers, a lot of the strong and resilient economy nonsense is going to come to an end. And we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months cracks in this economy. And that's going to lead us into a recession. Now, a lot of people anchor into the Great Recession and go, oh shit, housing prices are going to go down 30%. That's not what happens to real estate values. If you look back to every recession back to 1960, housing values have been flat or they've gone up, except for 2008. That was a different recession. That was a recession that had bad debt on a lot of and fake demand on a lot of residential properties that caused that Great Recession. That is not the situation that we're in today. What typically happens in recessions is mortgage rates drop precipitously, which means you can go out and buy properties that don't cash flow today, but at a 5% rate, they're great buys. At a 4% rate, they're screaming buys. And I think you will find, my call is we'll see 5.25% mortgage rates before the end of 2025. So be thinking about how are you going to deploy capital to create cash flow on those properties you're going to buy, and be thinking about that long-term perspective where I want to lock up this money for as long as possible and let inflation devalue that debt over that long periods of time.
Amen. I mean, one of the things that I've talked about with a lot of our investors is this idea of some of these bigger multifamily, some of these bigger commercial buildings, because their cap rates have risen, are essentially 30% off right now, 20% off. If we can buy one that makes sense today, if it makes sense today, and as rates change over time, it literally goes from a good deal to a great deal as rates go down, and you just get that much more value as your debt service goes down and the available cash flow goes up.
You're 100% right. The challenge is when you get into those commercial properties is a lot of them have pretty nasty prepayment penalties on them. So you need to put yourself in a situation where if I can put money to work in a high quality building that doesn't have a ton of deferred maintenance, and I can make a little bit of cash flow now, and I can get a carve out for any prepayment penalty for refinance, you're going to make a killing when you go to refinance that loan. So one of the things that I've been able to do is there's regional banks out there. Give you an example, like Washington Federal. Washington Federal is a bank that's California, Washington State, kind of down through Utah, down to Texas.
We use them.
Okay, cool. Anton uses them, right on. I've been able to negotiate with them. Hey, I'll do this deal. I'll pay, the points to get into this thing, but I want to carve out of your prepayment penalty. If I refinance with you, not another company, if I refinance with you in the next 24 months, I want to carve out where you will not charge me that prepayment penalty because I'm bringing the loan back to you. If I sell the property, hit me with the prepayment penalty. If I don't refinance in 24 months, hit me with the prepayment penalty. But give me a carve out for 12 to 24 months. Sometimes you got to pay a little bit more in terms of points up front. But to your point, there's this moment in time where you might be able to buy something at a 7 cap. And if we're financing at a 7 cap, like the cash flow is probably pretty meager. But if you get to refinance that thing down to a 5% interest rate and you bought at a 7 cap, you got a home run over the next 10 years.
Amen, brother man. That's absolutely perfect. Thank you everyone for listening. Josh, how can people get a hold of you if they want to do a loan, they want to chat about investing? What does that look like, sir?
Yeah, I mean, Josh Mettle is kind of a unique name. So you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on X. And if you want to email me, feel free to do so. I'm josh@joshmettle.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. You're amazing. Everyone, hit the magic subscribe button, hit the like, share this with a friend that needs to hear this, because how many investors are missing out on the wisdom that Josh just shared? And they're so caught up with some other thing in their spreadsheet, they're not thinking long-term enough about the value of the dollar is going down right in front of our eyes. And if they don't believe you, just simply go, what happened to your grocery bill over the last 3 years? That should be the prime example of inflation right there.